December meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. It's also the last meeting of the term. So I'm going to ask that we come to order and start with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. So we have before us first routine applications. May I ask the clerk to read them?
GM1 from GEMS for $2,350,000, a release of conditions, the second half payment fiscal year 1920. HD4 from the Health Department, $25,000 for the additional appropriation for marine equipment. TA2 from TAG for $73,750 for the release of conditions, contribution to TAG and Safe Rides.
These motions come to us through the Budget Committee. Coming from a Budget Committee, they don't require a second. I'm going to ask the Chair of the Budget Committee, Mrs. Moriarty, to move these items and then report.
All right, I move the routine applications. I don't need a second. Okay, the report. GM1, GEMS release of conditions for $2,350,000. Tracy Sheetender and Tom Miserendino, the Director of Finance, Tracy's the Director of GEMS, attended the Budget Committee last Tuesday. They reported on both the operational and financial results of GEMS for the first half of this fiscal year. During that time, they've completed a new 10-year agreement with the town. On their financial statements, their revenue is ahead of budget, including their training initiatives. Their expenses are below budget due to restructuring actions that they have taken, and they have renegotiated the lease for their headquarters and will stay in their current location on East Putnam. Operationally, their cardiac performance continues to outpace the national average, and they continue to deploy new equipment, which is raised through fundraising efforts, not through the town. They put in 2 outdoor AEDs at Todd Points, and they're currently fundraising for additional units to be placed outdoors at the high school to be used by people on the fields. They have also trained their staff on cybersecurity protocols. The vote at the Budget Committee was 4-0-0 to recommend the release of the conditions. HD4 came through the Health Department for the Shellfish Commission, $25,000 for an interim appropriation. The Shellfish Commission made this request to replace the engine in their boat. Their boat operates 12 months a year, and currently the boat is out of commission until this engine replacement is completed. The commission has over $300,000 in its reserve restricted account and is requesting the use of those funds for the repair. This request will require RTM approval since it causes them to exceed their approved operating budget, which was integrated as part of the budget presented to the RTM last May. Quotes were received for the work anticipated. They were about $21,000, which is why they were requesting $25,000 to make sure they have sufficient funds, and any unused funds would be returned to the reserve restricted account. The vote at the Budget Committee was 4-0-0. TAG 2, TAG's release of conditions on $73,750. This release represents the remaining appropriation from the town for fiscal 20. Their cash flow is dependent on the availability of these funds as their fundraising efforts are mostly in the second half of the year. They still expect to achieve their full year budget, which is just slightly ahead of break even, and the vote at the Budget Committee was 4-0-0.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Moriarty. Are there any questions or comments from any of the members to these items? Before I take a vote, let me mention that Laura Erickson, who we voted to fill the vacancy left by Mrs. By our chair, was sworn on the 1st of December. So she's now a sworn member of the group and will be voting tonight. I'll take a vote now. All in favor of the approval of these items, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Abstentions. 1200. Assessors report. Ms. Elliott is away on vacation. I've asked Mrs. Tarkington to fill in with a brief report on the assessors report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought I would just read, at least initially, the overview that Ms. Elliott prepared for her monthly report. And it reads, "The Assessor's Office has completed the real estate permit work for the October 1st, 2019 grand list. The 2008 supplemental motor vehicle list has been sent to Quality Data Services for the January billing. In addition, all address changes and new owners have been entered from October 1st to November 30th for the real estate portion of the January 2020 billing. The motor vehicle and personal property lists for the October 1st, 2019 grand list are being finalized." Now, just to add a couple more comments here, I think what you can tell from this is that the Assessor's Office is really handling 3 separate grand lists at this point in time. The billing that for our property taxes are based off the October 1st, 2018 grand list. The department is finalizing the grand list of 2019. The assessor will sign off on that before the end of January. And all the real estate is done. They're basically filling in with the additional automobile information. And the department is ready to begin the revaluation process for the October 1st, 2020 grand list. Most properties now, residential properties, have been reviewed for the physical part of the revaluation, and only a small number in districts 10 and 11 left to remain to be reviewed. And there are 2 outside firms that do the revaluation for the town. The documents are completed and signed off, and that work will begin in early January. So it's a busy time in the assessor's office. Thank you.
I'll supplement the report of Mrs. Tarkington just to say that the assessor's written report is in the packets that were distributed, and I'll entertain a motion now to accept the report of the assessor.
So I so move that.
Is there
I'll second.
any further discussion or comment on the assessor's report or any questions? All in favor of accepting the assessor's report, please kindly say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, 1200. Before I move to the controller's report, I see that we have our first selectman, whoops, where'd he go? Oh, all right, I'll come back to it then in a minute. Sorry. I'm aware that today is Tony Turner Day, and I believe the first selectman has a proclamation. We were going to speak also about and to Tony at the end of the meeting, but so that I don't waste the first selectman's time, when the first selectman comes back in, we'll entertain that proclamation. Moving forward, vote for the moment with the controller's report, Mr. Mynarski.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. A couple of comments, then I'll open it up for questions. The first item on the controller's report is the CAFR and the associated single audits. I have comments, but it's on the agenda later under new business, and I'll have my comments for this section later in the evening.
Thank you.
Item number 2 is the annual financing. We're going to go to market January 8th, 11 o'clock in the morning for bonds and 11:30 for bands. We're going to bond.
The 8th.
January 8th.
Thank you.
Last year was January 10th. The $40 million general obligation bonds and $50 million of bond anticipation notes known as bands. One of the, I was going to save this for the CAFR, but I'll introduce it's more appropriate here. Actually, in the last 4 years, starting in January of 17, we borrowed 75 million bands, then we went to 65 million, and then we went to 60 million, and then we went to 50 million in January. It's, I just saw this trend last week when I was putting the official statement together. it needs further analysis, but what it begins to say is that the spending obviously is slowing up, and we're not producing, accomplishing as much in the capital project area. Authorized on issue, you've got $55 million of appropriations where we haven't borrowed any money. So there is a trend there, and it probably calls for further investigation and reporting in February when we do our annual budget.
We'll look forward to it.
Two more comments, then I'll open it up. The fire study is in the law department. We've asked that they expedite it so that we can proceed with the fire study. As you all know, Matrix, through the Special Projects Committee, that was assigned to review the RFP, picked Matrix. And then the final comment is on the second page. We were almost ready to come ask for some money for the invoice, the purchasing invoice processing project. We had the assessment done. We came back in July for $10,000. So we're going to come before you in January to ask for the additional monies. There was $75,000 set aside. The original quotes were close to 100. Having said that, I'll open it up to any questions on the controller's report.
Mr. Weisbrod.
Pete, just one question on the fire study. Any issues that are the issues on our side or the issues on the Matrix side? It seems to take a long time.
There's no issues. There's no issues at this point. There was no exceptions during the process, as you recall, as noted. As you know, the purchasing agent left back in May or June or somewhere. A lot of work queued up. It just they fell a little bit behind, and the process was delayed a little bit. But to answer your question, Mr. Weisbrod, no issues that I'm aware of.
Has the contract been reviewed by the legal department for Matrix?
No, that's where it is right now.
Oh, I thought you said it was in our legal department.
I'm sorry. No.
In whose legal department is the contract residing?
Our legal department.
Our legal department.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Did Matrix have any objections?
Only if we kick it back with issues.
Changes,
Yeah,
okay.
It doesn't happen that often.
Any other questions? Mrs. Tarkington?
Yes, Mr. Bernarski, I think you partially answered this before. I thought I had previously read that we were going to go to market with $40 million of the bonds and 60 bands. And the
50.
previous, I'm sorry?
50 million bands. Did I put the wrong number
No,
in
no,
there?
you put 50, but I thought in an earlier version, a previous controller's report, there was a total of 100, and now it's a total of 90. Is that,
Correct.
You have just adjusted it downward for the outstanding projects, and so I guess in terms of future payments, this is probably good, but we need to understand, as you said, some of these trends. Probably some of it has to do with the school funding and other monies that are coming in from things like that. But anyway, thank you.
Any other questions for the controller? Yes.
Thank you. So I was looking at the report and I saw that you're using a receivable module and you're going to start doing a little bit more optimization and use of technology. So I wanted to commend you on that. I think that's really important and just say thank you and hope that there's more opportunities like that. So thank you for being aware of it and staying on top of it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Hess. Any other questions or comments to the controller?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right next to me. Mrs. Moriarty.
I just wanted to ask, when you come back in January with the request for the purchasing funds to move forward on the purchasing, could you provide us with the current scope and expected outcome, just something in writing? We've talked a lot about it, but I don't know if the scope of the project has changed at all since we started the initial investigation.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I have it sitting over there, but we were almost ready to come this month, but it got slightly delayed, and we're going to come in January. But yes, we already have that.
Anything else for the controller? Do I have a motion to, sorry, I beg your pardon, Mrs.
I was
Tarkington.
going to say, a move that we accept the controller's report?
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Weisbrod. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0. May I look to the first selectman for a moment?
Now is your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the BET, and guests. Seeing that it's Tony Turner Day in Greenwich, Connecticut today, I'm here to read a proclamation. And as I've been telling people in my 11 years in Hartford, I used to summarize these things because otherwise I'd bring it to a grinding halt tonight. But this is condensed, so it won't take too long, but it's well worth it. Whereas the Board of Estimate and Taxation members spend countless volunteer hours on behalf of the town of Greenwich, and whereas time and effort have been spent on the proper administration of the financial affairs of the town, including issuance of the annual recommended budget and the setting of the town tax mill rate, the board also acts on requests for additional appropriations, transfers, and allotments made during the fiscal year. The town's annual report, comprehensive annual financial report, and component unit financial report for the retirement system of the town of Greenwich also fall under the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And whereas Anthony Tony Turner has been a Greenwich resident for nearly 30 years, where he resides with his wife and 2 children, both of whom attend the Greenwich Public Schools. He was a founder and owner of Financial Tracking, a regulatory software company based in Riverside. And whereas in January of 2017, Tony was unanimously appointed to fill a vacancy on the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and as a result of his appointment, he resigned from the RTM after 3 years of service. Tony served as a member of the New Lebanon Building Committee, RTM Health and Human Services Committee, a Cub Scout leader, past ruling elder at First Presbyterian Church, and co-chair of the Stewardship and Nominating Committee chairmanship. And whereas Tony is completing 3 years of service on the BET. And now, therefore, I, Fred Camillo, First Selectman of the Town of Greenwich, do hereby proclaim Monday, December 16th, 2019, as Anthony Tony Turner Day in the Town of Greenwich, and encourage all our residents to join me in recognizing his years of dedicated service to our community. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a comment. I remember my first meeting in January of 17, then Chair Mason promised fish and filet mignon at every meeting. I have now missed 36 dinners because that has yet to show, just for the record.
You missed this.
Got it. That was under the table. Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rammer.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. We have in the packet the treasurer's report. Are there any questions to the controller on the treasurer's report? I'm going to note our receipt of it and indicate that it's on the website and in the file. The next item on the agenda, number 6, is the standing committee reports. First, Mr. Weisbrot, any report from the audit committee?
We are going to discuss the CAFR, which I think is a separate item on the agenda, so I'll defer to that.
Thank you. How about, while I have your attention, for the Investment Advisory Committee? We
concluded we had our Investment Advisory Committee this morning, the last of the term, actually, of my chairmanship. I would like to just say, having reflected on this since our meeting this morning, that a number of interesting and I think noteworthy accomplishments emerged from the past couple of years, thanks to the work of all the people that were on the Investment Advisory Committee. In particular, the introduction of U.S. Treasury bonds as a vehicle for investment, which had not been the case before, as well as the substantial expansion of our certificate of deposit program, as well as the difficult engagement on the custodial issue as it pertained to Neuberger Berman. I think these and at the same time diversifying the risk in the general fund by, adding low-risk assets as just described, as well as increasing the yield. We were very fortuitous in the timing of the decisions that we made. So I would like to take this occasion to thank the members of the Investment Advisory Committee, but more importantly, to thank the management in the town, particularly Natasha and Pete Minarski, for the excellent work they've done in bringing us as far as we've come. Thank you.
Mr. Turner, on Tony Turner Day, you're chair of the Human Resources Committee. Any report from the Human Resources?
No report at this time.
And Mrs. Crumick, on behalf of the Law Committee, any report?
Yes. As the outgoing chair of this committee, I wanted to take the opportunity to do a couple things. I wanted to thank my colleague, Ms. Vasiliotis, who we've been through many different issues in the last 2 years, and I want to thank her for a lot of hard work. I also wanted to thank the Law Department, which is extraordinary in the amount of work that they have to carry out, in the timeliness, in a lot of the work that they provide when you're dealing particularly with the claims that are brought against our town. The deadlines are usually set by the courts and not by them, so they're under the gun a lot, and they make an effort to bring us up to date as we go along on these cases, and to discuss potential settlements and potential roadblocks, and I think we're very lucky to have such a strong team in the legal department. I'd also just like to bring to our attention some of the things that we've worked on in the last 2 years. We certainly we take on the resolutions that accompany the budget each year, and this brings us in contact with a lot of different departments and commissions when they want to either change the resolutions, or they want to tighten them up for some reason, or they want to address some new resolution that they'd like to put forward. We also got involved in the custodial agreement, which Mr. Weisbrod was referencing earlier. We get involved in reviewing insurance policies for the town. We got deeply involved in the senior tax relief ordinance that the assessor and the tax collector and the law department were all working on. We look carefully at the risk fund. We consider the self-insured retention. We also got involved in here, my colleague, Ms. Vasiliotis, spent time with the tax collector looking at the delinquent tax collection program and trying to put down on paper some of the procedures that make it a smooth operation. We looked at the Greenwich Transportation Center redevelopment agreement, and we also reviewed the auditor's letter that the town attorney was preparing for the auditors in order to look at the various claims that are being brought against the town. So again, I think these are just a sample of some of the areas that we address, but I'd like to thank again the law department and my colleague for hard work and 2 years of important work for the town. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Crumick. There are no liaison reports. On the special project teams, it was marked for a report from the Nathaniel Witherell Strategic Planning Committee. Since the report from that committee is on the agenda under new business, I'm going to pass over that item for the moment and move on to old business. We have one item of old business, which was to be, or is to be, a report on the appointment of committee members that were put forward by the chair. Mr. Mason, I think you believed you were intending to make a motion with respect to that item.
1 second, Mr. Chairman. I was, and let me just get that.
And hopefully you still are.
Yes, I just had to get the microphone on. I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules in order that the agenda be changed to take up our new business before the old business. In other words, I want to move the old business behind new business. And I know that will need a second, and that is a 2/3 vote.
I second.
So we have a second, and Mr. Mason's correct. This is a motion to suspend the rules, requires 8 supporting votes, a 2/3 vote. Mr. Mason is correctly noting that under our agenda on the new business, items E and F are items that have a similar subject matter. And so passing on his motion, approving his motion to put it behind E and F would allow those 3 items to appear together and to be dealt with at more or less the same time. Is there, no, I'm sorry, there's no discussion on a motion to suspend the rules. It's a non-debatable motion, but I would take a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And abstentions? It passes 12-0. The first item of new business is the report of the BET Special Project Team on the Nathaniel Witherell Strategic Planning report, which was dated the 6th of December. It's on the agenda as a first read, and I've asked the committee members to please confine their remarks. Normally, we don't have any remarks on a first read. I'd be grateful for any committee members that would be prepared to defer their remarks until the matter comes up for discussion at the January meeting. But are there members that feel strongly that it's important that they speak today?
Yes, just a quick comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you had heard, the packet in the report today is a first read, and it's from the Nathaniel Witherell Strategic Planning Committee. The predecessor to this committee was the BET's Special Committee on the Nathaniel Witherell, established back in 2016. With the new term beginning in 2018, the BET changed the name of the committee and reconstituted the membership. The 4 voting members were Beth Kremick, who was a carryover from the prior committee, and new members Jeff Raymer, Bill Drake, and me, Andy Deuce. Non-voting members and carryovers from the original committee were Art Norton as its chair, Nancy Weissler, and Joe Oberlander, another carryover, served as an ex officio member. The report today is presented as a first read, and accordingly we ask the discussion of the report be deferred until the January meeting. Prior to the January meeting, however, I expect that the chairman of the committee, Mr. Norton, who is currently out of town, will circulate a transmittal letter. We hope that you take time to read the report, and we look forward to a full discussion on this in the January meeting. Thank you.
It is not a long report, and it's an eminently readable report. So I really would encourage the other members to read it. If you have questions or comments, or even editing corrections, I'd be grateful if you'd communicate with the chair of the committee, Art Norton. If for some reason you have difficulty reaching him, please communicate with me. I'll be glad to forward your comments. The timing of the discussion will be up to the new chair of the BET, but I would assume that this item is going to be on the agenda for the January meeting. I would like then next to move to the next two. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm so sorry.
I forgot to add, the report was approved by the committee at a vote of 3-1 with Mr. Raymer saying no. And also, I believe my colleague, Mr. Drake, has a brief comment as well.
All right. Just before you speak, Mr. Drake, I probably owe then some explanation. I had no objection or concern about the content of the report. As I'll discuss more fully in January, my dissenting vote was only a question of whether, from a due diligence standpoint, we should be further exploring some external extraneous information before the report was approved and released. But I was perfectly satisfied with the report itself. Mr. Drake, you wanted to be heard?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll try to be brief. Let's just touch real briefly on a couple of things that are in the report that is in your package tonight, the work of our committee over the last 2 years. One of them is we summarize some of the key factors from the 125-page report created by Health Dimensions Group earlier this year, 2019. You know, some of the conclusions were that the market analysis found that the demand for nursing home beds in the Witherell's market is projected to decline. There was financial benchmarking on pages 48 to 64 of that report, and the findings were that wages and benefits, the main costs at the Witherell, are well above comparable nearby facilities. There was an extensive operational assessment and recommendations on pages 73 to 123 for improving the Witherell's operating practices in the areas of leadership, management, marketing, the business office, human resources, clinical, reimbursement, and therapy areas. As for the examination of strategic options, HDG concluded that all the 3 strategic alternatives would deliver comparable results at lower cost. The least successful path is the one we're on, and you can see that on page 72 of their report, which is a table that we included in our report. And I've nearly completed what I was going to say, but let me pass out one page, which I think is very helpful if you'd share down the way. This, just to real briefly say, where do we stand today with the Witherell fund balance? This is an effort that we created with the help of Roland and Peter to just give you a snapshot of where you stand. The answer is if you look at the top page here, the actual fund balance on June 30, 2019 is negative $4,091,000. You'll find that number on page 101 of the CAFR that you all have in front of you that you just approved. But then if you look at what's happening in fiscal 20 and fiscal 21, it's below you here. The next 4 numbers are the net effect of operations, capital, and debt service from fiscal 20, from the budget that's been approved, and the variance to budget, which is expected. It is likely that the fiscal 20 year, which is nearly half expired already, will represent a deterioration of the fund balance of $4,476,000, which will mean 7 months from now, it's expected that the negative fund balance will be about $8.6 million, which you can see. As for the projections of 2021, they're also there. This budget has been created, but this is a best view of where the future, of what that year will be. Another deterioration of the fund of $4.55 million. So the best picture we can have of the Witherell as it is in front of you is that it's in bold at the bottom of the page, the projected negative fund balance of the Witherell before the town contributions for those 2 fiscal years is negative $13 million. That's what we 12 have to deal with soon. The committee recommended 2 preparatory steps that were important. You'll see these on the second page of our report. One is to make a full audit of the Witherell, and the second is to retain a financial advisor to communicate with potential counterparties about the possibilities to improve the care delivered to patients, to strengthen the management, and to stabilize the large and growing financial burdens to taxpayers. We think all 3 of those are the appropriate objectives. After those 2 steps, we'll be in a position to make some strategic choices. That was our original goal, and we're almost there. So please read our report and communicate with our committee members, and we'll have a meaningful discussion in January.
Thank you. Any other comment on the first read? Mrs. Kremick?
Yeah, I'd like to just point out that this is a document that none of us have seen until tonight, and it certainly paints a very negative view of Nathaniel Witherell. It's based on speculation of what will happen in the next 2 years. It's including some of the debt service, and I would ask everyone to take a deep breath, go back, read the report, and then let's have a honest discussion in January. I think this is a facility that has for many years been considered a jewel in the crown of this town, and before we start taking dramatic steps to change it, that we all get better educated as to what we're dealing with. And I'm sorry that you've decided to present such a negative view before we've even presented the report.
I think this is a good moment for the chair to say, I think we should be deferring further debate and discussion of this to the January meeting at a time when the members have had a chance to read the report. And with that, I'm going to carry on to the next item. I'm actually going to carry on. Pete, do you want to address the single audits and the CAFR together, or do you want to deal with them? Then let me call items 10B and C, which are the comprehensive annual financial report, the so-called CAFR, and also the federal and state single audits. Our controller, Peter Menarski.
Okay, you have before you the draft of the comprehensive annual financial report, which we will refer to as the CAFR from here on after, and the state and federal single audits in draft report. I want to thank my staff, Roland Geiger, Maureen Tracy, Angela Giancarelli, and Natasha Yemitz, who helped put this document together. Since the Governmental Accounting Standard Board's number 34 came along, which made this a very convoluted and difficult document, this is the first time the town has put it together internally. So I thank my staff. Regarding the management letter, which we vote on every December, there is a document that reviews internal controls and makes management letter comments that have to be corrected. This is the first time we've had no management letter. I'll start out by saying that we've had, since the presentation by RSM US LLP last at the BET Audit Committee, we've asked for and gotten a number of edits from Mr. Deuce, Ms. Hess, and Laura Erickson. I didn't have a chance to get Laura Erickson's comments into this draft. However, I can assure you that all of the edits that have been supplied by the 3 BET members are going to be in the final. They're already in there, but I had to print this document out on Friday. So the edits that all 3 of you have forwarded to me and I forwarded to RSM should be incorporated into the document. If I could, hope I'm not taking anything away from Mr. Weisbrod, but can I just, a couple of highlights on the CAFR.
I encourage that.
Okay.
So would Mr. Weisbrod.
There's two types of fund balance. There's on a GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, and there's the budgetary. The credit rating agencies look at the GAAP fund balance. Our fund balance for this 6/30/19 report has reached 62.8. It went up $2.8 million. Relative to that fund balance on a GAAP basis is the fund balance policy that the BET puts together. You have a range that you're supposed to be within between 5% and 10%, using capital non-recurring and the risk fund collectively. The general fund is at 9.99%, and collectively, the 3 funds are at 12.05%, which is a little bit above the fund balance ratios that BET has a policy for. I can say that it's come down slightly from last year. I'm looking at last year's, where it was 12.89%, and basically the unassigned fund balance portion has stayed the same, but the capital non-recurring fund went down about $1 million. We had a large number of expenditures from that fund, and the risk fund, as you all know, was depleted. And it actually has a negative $643,000 fund balance at June 30th, and through the work of the BET, we appropriated or used fund balance of $3 million, so we're back in the positive. And again, we'll address the risk fund in the budget deliberations in February. Debt policy, I can say that, and this is where I was going to actually refer to the borrowing. The outstanding debt policy is down to $216 million of general fund and other fund debt. It's come down from about $222 million from last year, and it'll probably go down to about $200 million of next year, which is somewhat good news, but it's tied into the spending, which is decreasing when I refer to the bands going from 75, 65, 60, and 50. And only negative in the CAFR has been alluded to with Mr. Drake of the negative fund balance. But overall, it was a good year. Again, I thank my staff. We did well. And overall, the financial performance, the town is very healthy. We're in a very good shape, and everything looks fine. I will now, through the chair, defer to Mr. Weisbrot if he has any comments from the audit committee.
No, I would simply underscore a couple of things that you said, Pete. Number one, that this is a year without a management letter should be understood and recognized throughout the town as a significant accomplishment, which we're very proud to have achieved, and we, at least I give the credit to you and your staff for managing the controllership function as well as you have, so congratulations on that. The only other comment, I'm glad that you're incorporating the input from the members of the committee, which is great. And the third comment I thought I would ask is that insofar as the single audit was not available to the members of the audit committee at the meeting we held, to the extent there is a deficiency cited here that you might want to just give us, quick insight as to the nature of that deficiency, since we hadn't had a chance to review it at the audit committee.
Okay. Again, the smaller document is a combination of the federal and state single audit. There was an accounting change years ago where the auditors would independently audit every single grant. So they changed the rules so that they combine them all, and then they have one audit that covers all of the state and federal grants. The weakest area that we have is assigning the expenditures and revenues into the proper year. We've had this debate for years with the auditors. We can't win it. They're the boss. They're the oversight. An example I'll give you is when we did have a management letter comment last year, the Town Aid Road, we get $750,000 a year divided by 2. And this is an example of the deficiency Mr. Weisbrot is referring to, which carried over, is we got the money late from the state. We got it at the end of June. We booked it as revenue, and the auditors wrote us up and said that you put it in the wrong year. Because they didn't spend the money in the same year, we had to defer the revenue, and that's an example of deficiency Mr. Weisbrot is referring to. And we have situations where we have multi-year grants, especially in the area of the Board of Education, where it's very hard to track and match the revenues and expenditures. Again, it's our weakest area. So what we propose to the auditors going forward is we're going to have a strategy session every July, in July or August, sit down before the audits is we got the 60-day rule with the auditors and go over beforehand and determine which grants belong in which year. So that was actually the deficiency. It's not an internal control weakness. It's a deficiency that washes out in the second year. When you have, if you say, for example, you've put the revenue in year 1 and it belonged in year 2, at the end of year 2, it's washed out. So that's actually what Mr. Weisbrot is referring to.
Mr. Mason.
One statement and sort of one clarification. Going forward, there's more things we're going to get audited on each year because there's more required reporting that we have to do on leases and et cetera, correct?
Yes.
So the workload's going to increase going forward on what the audit committee and what you're going to be dealing with. The other thing is on the fund balance, and I want to thank Ms. Moriarty on this, because the fund balance policy we always get a lot of questions on our fund balance. So June 30th, our fund balance is X, but after that, the budget is higher for the next year, so therefore it changes the percentage of our fund balance, because as our budget goes up, because our fund balance policy is 5 to 10% of the operating budget. So as the budget goes up, that 5 to 10% number actually, that changes. And then, as when we start in February, we look at what we've used post-June 30th, and this year we've used a fair amount, if I'm not mistaken. So going back to your February comment, so from a public point of view, that's where we start the budget process in February, is to know where we are. And this year, we've had a lot of conversations about if we are over that policy, what we'd like to do with it, and I'm sure the next term's budget committee will have a lot of discussions on that. But just to clarify that, but thank you again. I think, Mr. Weisbrod said it, but I think you've done yeoman's work, you and everybody involved, and I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Any other comment on the, I'm sorry, Mrs. Hess?
Just regarding the CAFR, I just want to add the point,
Thank you.
the heavy lifting that goes into preparing this document. The financials are the responsibility of management, which would be, Pete, the finance team. And best practice is actually to have management prepare it and have the auditor do it, which is something that's happens at the corporate level. And I don't know that the municipalities have caught up, but we're ahead of the curve on this one, and it's a best practice. And so I know there's a lot of work that goes into this. So I think this was your first full year where you took full responsibility, you and the team. So again, want to thank you. I thought it was a really well-done document, so thank you so much.
That didn't stop her from making one or two corrections, however. Yeah. No, indeed, yeah. Mrs. Tarkington.
I would just like to add a little bit more color to Mr. Weisbrod's comment about no management letter. I mean, I think this is very commendable in this recent period of time, not this year, but, within the last couple of years, because of the town's audit committee's policy to change auditing firms or the partner. The town now uses the partner in New York City. I think that was a major change for the town of Greenwich, and it put us into a more, we'll call it sophisticated group in terms of the complexity, and the fact that we came out of, a year where there was some change and then a transition, and then now no management letter is just amazingly commendable to you and your entire team and every department head, because it's really the departments that get mentioned within the management letter. It isn't necessarily, something that's happening in the finance department. So, the commendation really goes to every department head in the town of Greenwich, and what a great job they're doing. And Pete, of course, and his team also, because that's why they're doing well.
Thank you all. Yeah.
So I guess this is Pete Minarski Day as well. Are there
And
any?
Roland Geiger.
And Roland
Don't
Geiger.
forget Roland this time.
Roland.
Are there any other questions or comments from the controller on the single audits or the CAFR? Now, Pete, I'm unclear. Since they're draft documents, they're not for us to accept at this point. They're going to come back in the January meeting for final approval?
No. The process is you accept this. I have to, by state statute, have this document filed with the Office of Policy and Management by December 31st. And I also have to have it to the right repositories for the borrowing. And I have to have it for the final document for the official statement. Everything has to be completed by December.
And you require a vote of approval from the BET on the documents?
Documents, yes.
Yes. All right, so we're going to vote to approval with the expectation that the few corrections that were brought to your attention, you'll be implementing between now and December 31st.
And two things. It will be on the website, and you'll get the fancy copies. They'll be available in about a week.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, can I make a motion to approve the comprehensive annual financial report for the fiscal year 19 and the federal single and state single audits?
And I second that.
Seconded by Mrs. Tarkington. Any further comment before we vote? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, 12-0-0. Item 10D on the agenda is capital project closeout form. The chair of our budget committee, Mrs. Moriarty.
Yes, this is an item added to the agenda. The Budget Committee voted unanimously to recommend the addition of a project closeout form to the required financial forms in the capital process. The goal here is to improve documentation in the capital process, starting from the approval where we have the CIP sheets to a form at the end of a project. It will provide accountability so that we get, the BET gets information on project planning and will help us with future capital decisions. Currently, the way a department closes out an appropriation is just to contact the finance department to indicate that the project's been completed, and then it's closed out within Munis. But there's no documentation, there's no supporting detail, and there's no permanent record of that, of the action. The form that's presented before you was designed to provide just key information from the CIP sheet. It was designed not to to require significant additional work from the departments. It will use the financial forecasts that were in the CIP sheets, and the actuals will include the breakdowns that are represented in Munis. They may not be the same breakdown, so we may only get a bottom line dollar for the project, but I think that that still is better information. It will require a qualitative description of what scope was accomplished in a project, and it will provide information on reimbursements if they were anticipated at the time of approval. I think the BET can choose, the Budget Committee may be the right format to review the implementation of this form to see if it's providing the impact that we want it to do and to determine the impact on departments after a period of time. The way it would roll out is the department will use a form, have to supply the form to request a closeout of an appropriation. They could submit it at any time of the year. The finance departments will keep these forms and will distribute them on a periodic basis to the BET, maybe quarterly or some basis that makes sense to us. At this time, we don't expect that it would be added as a routine committee agenda item, but that, of course, can be changed later on. So with that introduction, I'd like to put on the table and make a motion to add the project closeout form to the required documentation to be submitted to the Finance Department upon completion of a capital project.
Is there a second to that motion? Mr. Mason, second, yes?
I seconded, or was Tarkington?
Well, it's, Mr. Mason seconding. Is there any comment or discussion on this particular item? Mrs. Hess?
I think this is a great idea. Leslie Moriarty and I, when we were Board of Ed liaisons and working with them on the capital project, we talked about the closeout process and putting some better controls and transparency around it. So I fully support it. I think it's a great idea. Just a couple of things that jumped out at me and I get you want to keep it simple, because if you keep it simple, people will be more inclined to do it and do it quicker. But two things I thought about is, when you look at the budget and then the actual, just were there any interim appropriations that came between the two? And then were there any conditions on this when the budget was originally implemented? I was going to ask about transfers, but I know people are not supposed to do it, so I guess we shouldn't ask, but and just assume no one's doing it. But those were the three things that came to me. But thank you. I think it's a great idea, and I support it.
Any further comment on this item? Mrs. Tarkington?
So I think there's a couple other things that this does, which is, it also allows us to evaluate where we've approved a project, say a bridge project, and there's been certain revenues connected or potential revenues connected, grants or whatever to the bridge, as we get to the closeout, to get a defined number of how much money has been received. I think that's one very important point. The other is also a notation on the certificate of occupancy. I think very frequently we sort of go to the point of temporary certificates of occupancy, and this basically outlines when the actual certificate of occupancy is received. So I think there's some real pluses that we'll see how it works, but I expect it to work well. I think it's a great idea, and thank Leslie for putting it together, and then the Budget Committee for, moving it forward.
Any other comment on this particular item?
I have just a question through the chair.
Mrs. Vasiliotis, yes.
Mrs. Hess had indicated that she would like to see two things. Will they be put on it, or do we need to amend the form, or how would you like to proceed on that?
Can I answer?
Mrs. Moriarty?
The form was designed by Mr. Geiger with our input on what we want to see on it, and I would be happy to continue to work with him to integrate the comments that were made.
And Ms. Erickson.
I guess that was my question, is to what extent was Pete and Roland involved in the preparation of this form? And from a process standpoint, did the Budget Committee vote on this item to bring it forward? And what was the vote?
Sorry. Good.
Yeah, in my introduction, I said the Budget Committee voted unanimously 4-0 to add the form to the documentation.
Answer your questions. Any other questions on this item? Then bringing it to a vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Abstentions? That too is 12-0-0. The next items on the agenda, 10E and then also 10F, were motions that have a similar subject matter. They relate to the SEC investigations affecting 6 of the members of this board. I had hopes that these motions were going to be disposed of by being postponed indefinitely, and that appears not to be the case. Which makes it then perhaps more necessary that one begin to address the underlying issues. I'm going to do as follows, if I may. Would you each take one and pass that in the other direction? I'm going to start by speaking, if I can, and then I will also entertain comment from anybody else. We've been dealing with this issue openly in the public for the last 3 months. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, you're right. Sure, that would be a good idea. First, if I may, can I introduce for the third time Mr. Stephen Fogarty from the firm of Haller & Sage, and if you'd come forward and join us, that would be fine. Mr. Fogarty, Attorney Fogarty, has been hired by the town attorney to be acting as town attorney pro tem on this matter. It was the choice, the decision to do it was that of the town attorney, and the selection of attorney was also that of the town attorney. The motion 10E before us reads as follows, if I may. Motion A, for the chair to issue a request to the town committees for adequate training of future candidates in campaign finance regulation, and B, for the BET to return to its core business and focus on the affairs of the town. And indeed, it's my hope that after these motions have been concluded, there will be an opportunity for the BET to do exactly that. While those papers are being distributed across to you, I want to make a few prefatory comments, if I can. There's been a lot of accusation out in the press, much of it of an unpleasant nature, and I think it's necessary to clear the air to a certain extent. There's also been an email containing 300 some odd pages of documentation which were disseminated. I think what one needs to do maybe at this point is, for me at least, others can speak if they like, to address exactly what these events were, and how they came about, and how they've been disposed of to this point. I want the public to know at large that I rather openly opened my file on this matter to Mr. Mason, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Deuce, Mr. Drake. I had a conversation with Ms. Fasiliotis indicating a willingness to do it there too. Please, Ms. Hess, don't think that I was ignoring you. It just didn't happen that I had the occasion to be serving on committees with you to make the same offer to you. This matter has, in fact, been fully investigated by the SEC. It was pending before them for 16 months as to the claims that affected the 5 of us, 17 months as to those that affected Mr. Turner. In a sense, it was pending before them in total for 18 months. It was thoroughly investigated by an investigator by the name of Scott Branfer, who was a retired police detective from the New Haven Police. It was then taken over by an attorney, a prosecutor by the name of James Talbert Slagle. They propounded written interrogatories to which we responded. We wrote a lengthy narrative. I copied out for them my whole file, a very laborious process. I believe all the other defendants did exactly the same. I don't know that for sure, but I know that I did. We wrote a detailed email by email chronology describing exactly the context in which each and every email was generated. We were interviewed twice. I know that the prosecutor spoke with independent witnesses, at least one had mentioned to us that they were so interviewed. I have no idea how many were spoken to. I know they also spoke to Mr. Mark Miller, who was the treasurer for Mr. Turner's campaign. This was not a summary process. It's not accurate when it appeared in the press that there's been no investigation. I think there was a very thorough investigation, and it resulted in 3 rather detailed consent agreements, which I think are out in the public domain. If anybody hasn't seen them, I'd be glad to show it to them. Secondly, I know that Mr. Turner has expressed great pain and angst at the responses that we gave to the prosecutor. It's worth my mentioning at the outset that the portion of the complaint against Mr. Turner that related to his spending on other candidacies was only a small part of the complaint against him. Paragraphs 15, 19, and 25, 25 having 11 subparagraphs, cited Mr. Turner for business contributions to a campaign, which is verboten, has nothing to do with us. The paragraphs 14 and 16 talked about the use of personal funds and funds that were unreported on his filings. That too has nothing to do with us. Paragraph 18 of his consent agreement talked about the exceeding of limits that were allowable on certain funding to campaigns where the funding was not coming from his candidate committee. That had nothing to do with us. There were 3 paragraphs, paragraph 20, 24, and 26, in which he was charged with having spent money that benefited candidates other than himself, meaning that his candidate committee was spending money on the campaigns or the benefit to campaigns other than his own, which is also verboten. At the end of Mr. Turner's consent agreement comes the following legend, which the only way for me to do it is perhaps to read it exactly as it reads. I think it should be accurate. Respondent willingly enters into this agreement and order, but neither admits nor denies any of the enumerated claims or allegations contained in this agreement or order. So it's a little hard to understand exactly how one handles his signing of the consent agreement. You have to take it with the qualification that it was written. It is worth mentioning before you pass from it that he, in addition, agreed to pay a fine of a fairly substantial $52,000. Our consent agreement, entered into about a month after his, contains basically the following allegations. First, that we relied upon a very pivotal email from him of October 2nd, 2017, and that we relied in good faith upon what we understood to be representations from him that his campaign arrangements, including the funding, had been reviewed and approved by the SEC. And that we believe that those statements from Mr. Turner, though, constituted statements and a behavior which was deceptive, misleading, and lacked a full disclosure. And those are quotes, and those are statements to which Mr. Turner has expressed a particular irritation and pain, and we acknowledge that. At the same time, it's important that I be clear that our consent agreement also said that each of we 5 defendants, that we, the respondents, that we acknowledge that we have responsibility to fully comply with the campaign regulations of the state. And when we rely on advice or information we're receiving from others, we do so at our peril. And if for some reason we receive information which is incorrect and we rely upon it and we make mistakes as a result of that, that is our responsibility. They may be unintentional violations, but those are our responsibilities, and that's a responsibility that we each have undertaken. In a moment, I want to go through the documents that I have distributed to each of the members here. By the way, I have a few copies for Pete and Roland, if you like, and one perhaps also for Attorney Fogarty. Ken, I'll share with you later on if you like. Before I look at the documents, let's look at some facts. The particular facts, as they address the personal circumstances and business circumstances of Mr. Turner, are not particularly well known to me, but relying upon a few assumptions, I think the circumstances were basically as follows. Mr. Turner developed a very successful company, Financial Tracking, that had a positively brilliant technology for portfolio compliance monitoring alerts, very useful to the mergers and acquisitions, for pre-trade clearances, surveillance, useful also to portfolio managers, useful to regulators, useful for people who don't want to get into trouble with regulators, useful to hedge funds and private equity, and not surprisingly, a lot of people beat their way to his door wanting to buy that technology, his business, from him. And in the fullness of time, just about the time of the elections, about a month or so before the elections, he in fact sold his business to ComplySci. And their interest was in his technology. They weren't particularly interested in having his office space or his typewriters or his computers or his file cabinets. They weren't particularly interested in his employees. I don't mean this in a negative way, but probably not particularly interested in Mr. Turner either. They basically wanted the technology. Mr. Turner is a warm, gregarious person, perfect person for politics, finds himself in his early 50s with a ton of money on his hand and not a lot to do, was interested in politics, and I think he had the notion that I think I can understand how I can run a campaign that would win the majority at the BET, and if I achieve that, I would likely be the chair, and that's an excellent launching platform for a political career, which is interesting to me. Now, I know none of that. I've made some suppositions. I hope I haven't bruised Mr. Turner in making those suppositions, but they was an estimate that I have made. Shortly after that, he makes a generous offer to the Democratic Town Committee that my now empty office would be a perfect place to put the campaign headquarters, and the campaign headquarters was moved into Mr. Turner's office. And I don't know it, but I have a feeling that a number of the people working on the campaign may well have been former employees at Financial Tracking. You need to look at the facts as you're about to look at them in the documents and see them through our eyes at the time, not with the benefit of a hindsight. And with that, I'd like to take you into some of the documents themselves, which I have distributed to you. I have to take you first to a document which is not chronologically first, but it's the pivotal one for us, and that's the very important October 2nd email that the five of us received from Mr. Turner. And you have it in front of you, but I'd like to read it to you, just because it is so central to our importance. It reads as follows: confidential. Hi, team. After we all met in the candidates meeting last week, I have spent a great deal of time with the SEEC Enforcement Division on how to campaign and promote voting for all Ds and down ballot for BET, all with a view to gaining BET control and not breaking any rules. You may recall that's my real objective, and all the voter models say it's doable, although quite expensive and a heavy lift. Today I got the answer, and I think you will really like it. Both attorneys there agreed that in order to do this, I can promote electing all 6 of us, as long as I keep my name, et cetera, too, on the promo piece, in order for me to pay the vast majority of the cost. However, in doing so, I have to add attribution to the materials for each of the remaining 5 of us, e.g. paid for by, et cetera. In order to add attribution, the rest of you have to do one of 3 things. Claim an exemption on Form 1 that you'll be using only personal funds for your campaign, AKA the personal exemption. Form a candidate committee with a treasurer, as I have already done. Or claim on Form 1 that you're not going to spend over $1,000. They said that paying $1,000 for the effort would be reasonable for each to contribute to get the attribution. No higher amount is required. So I feel strongly about continuing to go down this path, but we have to get unanimous okay and participation of $1,000 each. This is our only option. What do you think? Let me know as soon as you can, as I have the printers, phone bankers, door knockers organizing now for the next wave of promotion. Oh, you should have gotten a postcard already as a start to the effort, laying out the foundation to begin telling the story. Please join me for this endeavor, Tony Turner. I would like to highlight 1 or 2 things that he's saying there so that you keep these in your mind. He talks about this being quite expensive, a heavy lift, that he's paying the vast majority of the cost, that he's telling us that our contribution, they said $1,000 is reasonable. No higher amount is required. Both SEC attorneys agreed, and most importantly, I can promote all 6. If you turn to page 2 of the materials that you have there, you have a rather early email. This is an email on the 8th, see if I read it right, print is tiny, of the 8th of September. It's fully a month before that. This is an email in which, I'm sorry, I need to, not an email, first of all, it's something else. The habit at the SEC is when they have contact with the inquiring public, at the conclusion of the conversation, they run back and they create what you and I might call a memo to the file. They call them tickets, and they number them. And from our discovery process, through an FOI request during the pendency of our matter before the SEC, we asked to see some of these tickets because, frankly, we didn't know most of the background information. And this is, you'll be looking at a number of tickets, but this is the first of them. This is a memo to the file, so to speak, by the SEC attorneys of a contact that they've had with Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner makes an inquiry, focus on the fact here that for the moment, he inquires if an individual acting alone wants to promote or defeat candidates, is he required to form a PAC, he asks. In the second part of the question, he says, if the person is a candidate himself, is he able to do that regarding another candidate? And then dropping down also in the red line things, as you're looking at the answer, they're focusing on, particularly the text a bit from the bottom where it says, called with more information. This is Mr. Turner calling with more information. He's on the ballot for BET, Democrat. There are 6 slots for Dems. 6 people have been nominated, no opposition. The same on the Republican side. So it's just a formality going through the election. The communication he wants to put forward will be to independently promote the Democratic Party, the values, the get out the vote, GOTV, get out the vote, et cetera. Nothing about candidates. He wants to do it independently and will be spending over $5,000. And then dropping down, called back with SK. SK is the initials of one of the attorneys that he's speaking to at the SEC. Learned that he might spend upwards of $50,000 and is a member of the town committee. What I want you to take away from this early inquiry is that you can see the mindset of Mr. Turner is that he wishes to be acting independently. He's not approaching them about how do I put together a slate of 6. He's looking for what is the path by which I may be doing things independently. If you turn over now to page 4. At page 4, he is sending on the 20th of September an email to all of us, and it reads as follows. It's the first time he's making contact with us about this plan. I've been giving some serious thought to getting a treasurer, forming a campaign committee, and doing some mailings. And then dropping down to the bottom, the campaign compliance staff attorneys at Secretary of State's office has advised that I will have to amend my previously submitted Form 1 where I indicated no spending. So for the first time, he's telling us of his plan. He's also telling us that he's in communication with, he here calls it the Secretary of State's office. The State Election Enforcement Commission, the SEC, is a subdivision under the Secretary of State's office. I'm now on page 5. On page 5, on the 25th of September, he sends an email. It's actually an email not to us, but I'm sorry. He makes an inquiry to the SEC. This is, again, one of these tickets. Dear Lindsay, he's referring to Lindsay Leung, who's one of the attorneys at the SEC. I'd like to have a few neighborhood barbecues across my district where I invite targeted registered voters and their families. And at the bottom, she's replying, who's paying for it? Committee, and where's it being held? At someone's house? No, at community centers. Be sure to include attribution, and his concern is about vote buying. It's the first time that they're beginning to address the issue of barbecues. I'm now on page 7. On page 7 is an email from Mr. Turner to this attorney at the SEC by the name of Lindsay Leung. Hi. Notice how overt and complete he is of exactly what his plan is. He's laying out exactly what he wishes to do here. And he says, hi, still exploring things, and I have another question. Since a muni candidate, meaning a municipal candidate, since a muni candidate forming a candidate committee can use unlimited personal funds to fund her campaign, can the candidates that form a political slate committee combine their personal funds in the slate committee treasury in unlimited amounts and use in a slate committee? And if yes, can a slate committee spend any amount it wants? Of course, the slate in this case would be a group of about 6 to 9 people in a muni election, all from the same party. Oh, do I understand that a candidate cannot be promoted by both a political slate committee and their own campaign committee? It can only be one or the other, right? Please let me know. If you'll now turn the page, you'll see that his email is repeated in this next ticket. And in the lower portion of the ticket, she starts to respond. This is Leslie Leong. Guide excerpts. Also, this is a quote from the publication of the SEC. Also, a candidate who initially sought reimbursement for an expense he or she paid may decide at any time to not be reimbursed and treat the expense as a provision of personal funds, but this varies based upon the candidate's funding source. A candidate in a candidate committee can provide unlimited personal funds, whereas the candidate funded by a town committee or a political slate committee can only provide funds up to his or her contribution amount. Then dropping down, a candidate in a candidate committee may provide his or her campaign with unlimited personal funds, which is a key difference from most of the choices of funding sources. Now focus on the fact that this response didn't really get to the core point that Mr. Turner was asking, and that is the ability for 6 to 9 people to be getting together and funding in unlimited and varying amounts. And so a short time later, on the 2nd of October, now on page 10, comes first a further inquiry in which Mr. Turner sends 2 attachments. They're campaign pieces, and he's asking if they're okay. You need to understand that the campaign pieces he's presenting are campaign pieces that show him promoting what he characterizes as BET Democratic candidates. It does not name Mrs. Moriarty, Mr. Raymer, Mrs. Krummick, but it also doesn't just say vote the Democratic ticket. It's in the in-between area, and responding to that sensitive area, now Leslie Young begins to reply, and she replies as follows. Candidate committees cannot promote candidates, cannot promote other candidates, but they are permitted to promote voting for one particular side, vote Democrat, vote row A. Here it's in between, not specifying the names, but providing identifying information. Then dropping down. That she's talking about Mr. Turner, he feels like he needs to be able to promote these others so that they can get the majority. One of them is in a candidate committee. The others have indicated that they're spending and receiving no money, but they can change into a candidate committee if so. You're walking a tightrope. We don't know which side you would fall. Our job is to keep you far from the line. If an opponent files a complaint, it would be a difficult question, and we don't know where the commission would come out. You're working together, spending a lot of money, etc. As far as clearly identifying other candidates, hard to know what the answer is. Will people know from what you laid out in the mailer who you're referring to? Difficult for us to know, but you're in a better position. You can see that if he put out a piece that said, re-elect the first selectman, the public would know exactly who he's talking about without the first selectman being named. That's different from saying vote row A. And the gray area that Mr. Turner is in is that he's identifying the group but not mentioning their names. And the staff attorneys are troubling here about whether or not he's on the right side or the wrong side of that line. It goes on. Can walk away from the line by just limiting to voting for you only. Or you can do it as you have it and have the candidates chip in some money too. Same amount if it features you equally. but they can pay less if it's primarily about you. The commission's precedent is that any reasoning is generally acceptable on how to divide up the shares. These candidates would have to get into a candidate committee, need all committee attributions paid for by, et cetera, and he's leaning toward doing it that way. That email went out, that communication went out to Mr. Turner at 8:19 on the 2nd, in the morning, on the 2nd of October. I'm on page 12. On the 2nd of October, at just before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on the very same day, he sends to us the email, and he does not express to the 5 of us the cautions, the gray area. What he's saying to us is only, it's quite expensive, it's a heavy lift. It's the vast majority of the cost that I'll be paying. Paying $1,000 would be reasonable. No higher amount is required. I've spent a great deal of time with the SE enforcement attorneys. Both attorneys there agreed I can promote all 6 of us. I'm now on page 13. He immediately follows that up with another email the following day in which he says, oh, by the way, the $1,000 will be paid directly to a vendor, such as a printer, as part of your individual campaign expenses, not a contribution to another campaign. Sorry to have omitted this earlier. On the 3rd, he also gets an email back from me in which I say, yes, I'm back in the U.S. I had been away for the last 2 weeks. I was in Ireland. Yes, I'm willing, although I'd like to have a better sense of the piece and of the plan. If there's an implication from Tony that he would be paying more than an equal share, I think that we should all be contributing equally. In response to which he, the following day on the 3rd, sends back, welcome back. We probably should get together. Are you game for breakfast / coffee first thing tomorrow morning? A day after that, he sends out an email to all 5 of us and says, hi, team. It looks like everybody's in, although I still need to give Jeff the plan and the details. And then it goes on. I'm on page 17. On page 17 comes a very important email, and it has a very odd thing about it that I'm going to touch on now, and then I'm going to say it again at the end. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, although it's confirming a conversation on October 13, 2017, there's a notation in the upper right-hand corner that the piece of paper I'm reading was created 6 months later on March 28, 2018, which I don't know the exact dates, but was more or less the same time at which Mr. Turner was served with the letter from the SEEC. Anyway, this now says as follows. Excuse my voice failing here. Yeah, I think I'll do that. It reads as follows. Tony, Howard and I were talking about a bunch of different questions, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page regarding the phone conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. So she's referring back to the phone conversation on the 2nd of October. If you can let me know when you have time available for a call, I'd really appreciate it. If you take a look on the upper page there, it says, he sends an email back saying, now? And in fact, they call. And she memorializes the call with the following statements. Concerned that Tony is advising candidates to act differently than advice given. We spoke about how joint expenses work and that each candidate's funding vehicle would need to pay the vendor directly for their pro rata share of the mail piece. Every candidate is responsible for making sure that their payment to this vendor are within the confines of their funding, not exceeding the $1,000 if that's their exemption, et cetera. So I want you to observe that she is memorializing a conversation with Tony. She says, we spoke. She says that she's concerned that Tony is advising the candidates to act differently than the advice that was given. I would say that's a fairly determinative email, a fairly determinative ticket. I do not understand why it was created 6 months after the conversation. I'm now on page 19. On page 19, Tony sends an email to us enclosing copies of the barbecue invitations, and he comments in the body of it there, reassuring us that he's still in tune with the SEC, that he got the okay from the SEC on the contents of the invite. Missing from these emails is any caution to us proximate to the worrisome email of October 13th that I'm now hearing from the SEC that I'm out on thin ice or whatever. We did not receive such a warning. If you go through the 300 or whatever it is page dump of materials that were sent to you over the weekend, I believe you'll not find any cautionary email to us from Mr. Turner within those documents either. I'm now on page 20. On page 20, the day before Election Day, the 6th of November, Mr. Turner sends to us a copy of an invoice from Seaside Design. It's the succeeding 3 pages, an invoice for $7,667.84, and the covering email says, would you each please send your $1,000 payment to Seaside, which each of us did. I'm on page 23. Page 23 is a photocopy of 1 page out of the publication of the SEC regarding the sharing of expenses and the advice that the SEC is given. So the sharing of expenses does not appear in the statute anywhere. What appears in the statute is a prohibition for any candidate to pay funds out of a candidate committee to another candidate. They, from a policy standpoint, though, had to deal with a situation of, well, what were 2 candidates share an event? What if they share an event in which the sharing wasn't equal? Can they share the cost in a non-equal way? Do they have to share the cost at all, et cetera? And so they make these policy pronouncements off the face of the statute, and it reads as follows. Candidate and political slate committees are prohibited from making any contribution or expenditure that benefits other candidates or committees. However, there are 2 exceptions to this rule. 1, a candidate committee or political slate committee may make a joint expenditure with other committees and pay its proportional share of the expenses of the joint campaign events. And then dropping down in a box, there's something called important note, and it reads as follows. A candidate committee that makes an expenditure to benefit other candidates must be reimbursed by the other candidates for their proportional share to avoid making a prohibited contribution. Proportional share means the proportion of the space or time devoted to a single candidate in relation to all other candidates. In the case of a printed advertisement, proportional share means the proportion of space devoted to each candidate. In the case of audio or video advertising, proportional means the percentage of the time used. Importantly, and I've underlined it for you here, the Commission will permit any reasonable allocation that is made in good faith by the treasurers of the involved committees. The remaining pages for the moment are samples I wanted you to see. That the materials that Tony was sending, this is not a copy of every single piece of material that he sent, but it's a good random sample to give you a flavor of what they are. He shows, do you know this fellow? I know that fellow. Don't you know this fellow's face? That's Tony Turner. And it says, elect Tony Turner, Board of Estimate and Taxation. Elsewhere, it says, elect all 6 Democrats running for Board of Estimate and Taxation. He's in that gray area in which he hasn't named us, but he hasn't just said vote for the Democratic ticket. Page 25, similar. I won't read the words to you. Similar. Photograph of him, elect Tony Turner, and then it says vote for the Democrats for the Board of Estimate and Taxation. And so too on 26, 27. When you get to 28, that's the barbecue. It has it there too. The one thing I mentioned about the barbecues is at the barbecues, Tony greeted the visitors at the gate as their host. Tony gave a speech. I attended 2 of the 6 barbecues. I don't know how many others did, but I didn't greet people at the gate. I didn't present myself as their host, and I didn't make a speech. I would say the pattern is there for a non-equal sharing. Would the SEC have accepted a sharing in which I pay $1,000 and Tony pays $343,500? I don't think I'd go quite that far. But you can see that there's areas here where there's debate on both sides. I think there's more players here than you realize. It was hard for me to understand the $52,000 fine that was levied against Tony. It seemed astonishingly harsh. I don't have a lot of experience in it. And I couldn't help but come to the impression, this is just a personal reaction, that I think that they felt a measure of responsibility that they didn't handle his inquiries as well as they could have. And rather than be a grown-up and say, we didn't handle it very well, to my mind, I think they went in the other direction and fined him very aggressively as if they were going to cover over their dissatisfactions or guilts with the ways in which they've handled it. I've tried to put forward an even-handed, maybe even at times generous review of the facts, but I don't want to talk about hypotheticals laid out in Greenwich Sentinel telling me that there was no investigation and that I'm corrupt and dishonest or whatever. I am responsible for the things that you have before you, not more, not less. To my mind, oh, by the way, for the lawyer on the panel down there, there's a lot of information on this subject at Advisory Opinion 210-08 and Declaratory Ruling of the SEC 2011-03. They lay out their policies. To my mind, we were relying upon a representation from Tony in the October 2nd email that I've spent a great deal of time with the SEC Enforcement Division, not breaking any rules. Both attorneys there agreed. I can promote electing all 6 of us. Quite expensive, heavy lift. I'm to pay the vast majority of the cost. You're paying $1,000 for the effort, and that would be reasonable. No higher amount is required. Those are all quotes out of that email. I relied on that. I'm responsible for my compliance with the SEC. If I rely on somebody else's advice, I do so at my peril. I said that in the instrument itself. If I rely on bad advice, I accept the consequences. Is the unintentionality a factor? Yep, it is. But I take responsibility for my lack of thoroughness in not getting my own information and making those mistakes. And I wanted to get that out there. It makes me feel better, if nothing else. Anybody else wish to speak? The matter before us, I'm sorry, yes, Mr. Turner.
Well, so much for Tony Turner Day. Let me, I think I'll start with this, and that is I'm, as I have been, very disappointed in the story that just unfolded for a couple of reasons. One, it has left out very material information, such as I sent a copy of the 2017 Municipal Candidate Election Guide to all 5 of my colleagues. Everyone had that, and you didn't say that tonight. Secondly, you were not privy to the conference calls that I had with the State Enforcement Election Commission along the way, once again, with me confirming a variety of things over the phone. Sometimes no tickets were made, and sometimes they were, because the ticketing system does not foot specifically with my personal notes. I contacted and continuously communicated with the 2 most senior attorneys there during the 9-week campaign. And I communicated with them the equivalent of every 48 hours on 12 different aspects of campaign laws. I went to great lengths to make sure there were absolutely no problems. And when they talked about a gray area, I always called back and confirmed it, or we confirmed it on the next conversation. The campaign, or the aspects of the campaign were either known by SEEK, it was pre-approved by SEEK, or they included suggestions such as being sure to add attribution. And they did that in their communications in writing to be compliant. They approved specific literature and flyers. I have emails that show that I proactively kept my colleagues in the campaign informed, essentially on a daily or a 24-hour basis, on a business week basis, And I was the rookie. I was proactively helping people. And that election in 2017 has done more for the people of this town than an election has in a decade. People are more awake and aware today than they ever have been about the quality of candidates. We have set record turnouts on both sides of the aisle. We have set record turnout percentages on both sides of the aisle. Republicans have had new records set, and so have Democrats. And Democrats won. Fair and square, a very clean campaign, never below the belt, and it focused on what every campaign ought to focus on, which is the issues. And I worked very, very hard to make sure that was happening. So though I was proactively helping people that were very seasoned candidates in the electoral process, running for state legislature, taking in campaign money from the state, school board, chairman of the Democratic Town Committee, and the list goes on. Yes, you should have relied on my conversations with Seek, because when you're talking to the two most senior attorneys at the commission, why would you not listen to my conversations about that? So I'm disappointed for those reasons, and I could go on, but I think there will be a more material conversation about that with the next motion. Thank you, Mr. Raymer.
Well-meaning people can have a disagreement about facts. I do want to mention, I never received, I don't think anybody else did either, a copy of the SEC publication. You have an email in there that says, enclosed is, it's sent to Mrs. Moriarty in response to her question about how does the attribution read, and you enclosed just the page from it that had the instructions on how attribution language goes. It didn't have the balance. It's a, pardon?
It's the full guide.
I didn't get the full, I only got the one page.
I think
Okay.
it's the full guide.
No. I'm certain of that. No, I'm certain of that. I did later, after the election was over, get the guide and
I
read
think
it.
you just made my point about leaving out material things.
Well, no, I mean, not willingly. I didn't receive a guide from you, but nor is it your obligation to send me the guide. My obligation to see that I do things properly, and I did what I did exactly as you see it in the documentation. Does anybody else wish to speak? Yep, sorry. I'm going to go to Mr. Weisbrod first because he spoke first. Mr. Weisbrod.
I just wonder how my Republican colleagues would respond to Mr. Turner's assertion a moment ago that the Democrats won fair and square, never below the belt. Apparently, the SEC, felt a little bit otherwise, and apparently the Republicans filed a complaint on this matter. So, but the Republicans have sought to make their bed with the aforementioned. I would also like to cite two sections in the settlement agreement that the 5 Democrats, other than Mr. Turner, had. Section 6 of that settlement agreement says, and I quote, "The respondents relied in good faith upon Mr. Turner's representation that he properly consulted the SEC compliance attorneys and crafted a plan that had been reviewed and approved by the SEC." Section 15 of the same settlement agreement, this is Section 15, quote, "The Commission, the SEC, does not contest respondents' view of the events reflecting Mr. Turner's omissions and understands that expenditures were made without their knowledge or approval," unquote. So I think the facts are laid out very clearly. Thank you.
Mrs. Moriarty.
The only thing I wanted to say is, I think this motion is on the agenda only because that's different than the next motion, because it was in response to the introduction of the next motion by 4 Republican members. The implication in this next motion is that there was a full investigation, and the attachments that they provided represent the outcome of a full investigation. I think it's evident from the conversation for the past hour, I believe, that there's lots of sides to this story. There's lots of information here that the SEEC spent time on and is not really germane to the business of the BET that we're currently looking at. And I think there is nothing to be gained by trying to shame members. There's nothing to be gained by the takeaway other than the campaign finance laws are complicated. They're difficult, especially when you're talking about running for an office where the aggregate votes for 6 people matter. And there's lessons to be learned for all candidates moving forward. Thank you.
Is there any further comment on this item? We have 2 separate items sequentially to bring to a vote. The item before us so far is just item 10E, the motion, and it reads, I should have read it before, but I'll read it now. Okay. Tell you what, why don't I have somebody make the motion and let that person read the motion they're making?
Okay.
Information?
Yes.
May I have multiple point of information? Number one, I'd like to ask if the chair would entertain that the motion, the 2.5, timeout, this 2.5-page document could be presented as in our agenda?
Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't seeking to have the whole instrument read. I was only seeking to have the full motion. It's 2.5 pages long, single space, and a bit tedious. A lot of it is quotes out of documents that I've already read to you. I was not looking to have somebody read that motion. I was having somebody read the agenda item. You have the motions, both of these motions in the packet. If there's somebody who wants the motions read, I'll be glad to read the motions, but absent that, I think we've kept these people here long enough. We'll go with with just the agenda items. Did you have another point of information?
Just the other point of information was that I think everybody's trying to create facts, and I think I heard something about the Republicans filing a complaint. The complaint with the SEC, I believe, was filed by the State Central Committee.
Of the Republican Party.
Yes.
Anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. Mrs. Moriarty, you're going to make a...
So I'll move new business item E. It's a motion for A, the chair to issue a request to town committees for adequate training of future candidates in campaign finance regulation, and B, for the BET to return to its core business and focus on the affairs of the town.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Crumick. Is there any further discussion on this item before it comes to a vote? Mr. Mason?
This resolution and the pages attached to it, I feel if I were to vote for that, I would be endorsing, in parts of that document, I would be endorsing a premise that, I'm going to use names if I'm permitted to, that Mr. Turner was right or wrong, or any other member was right or wrong, and that's not what this is about. I don't think that this BET, at least I am speaking for myself, was ever here to be judge or jury. I think that's the purpose of the committee, was to get this outside of this. And I would say that the whereas clauses, they have no legal import, but it does give a history and what they're putting forward a resolution. And another reason I wouldn't be able to support this is the BET, the statement about the BET returning to our responsibilities. I will say probably later this evening that there has been some challenges, but the BET has been doing its regular businesses. It's been approving guidelines, taking care of our normal items monthly. We've done the internal audit. We've done the letter. You've seen us do that tonight. We've introduced new project closeout sheets, and I give credit to my colleagues who have done that. So the BET's business is being done, and I don't think anybody's neglected their responsibilities in this process. So for that reason, I would not be able to support the item on our agenda, which I'm going to call under new business 10E.
Any further comment on this item before we bring it to a vote? Hearing none, I think this vote is a vote that I need to call names for. I'm calling Mr. Dewis. I'm sorry, it's obvious to you, I'm sure, but you're voting yay or nay. A yay vote supports the motion, a nay vote against.
I vote no.
Ms. Hess?
No.
Mr.
Yes.
Weisbrod? Mr. Drake?
No.
Mr. Mason?
No.
Ms. Moriarty?
Yes.
Mr. Raymer votes yes. Ms. Krummick?
Yes.
Ms. Tarkington?
No.
Mr. Turner? No. And Ms. Vasiliotis? No. Ms. Erickson? I make that to be 4-7-1. Motion fails. I'm next calling item 10F. I read the item on the agenda as follows. Motion submitted to the chair on December 2nd, 2019 by BET member Vasiliotis on behalf of BET members Mason, Drake, Dewis, and Vasiliotis, requesting that the chair issue a statement to the town committees regarding training of future candidates in campaign finance regulation. That is the item as it appears on the agenda. The motion itself, of course, is much longer, and it too is in the packet. If any member wishes me to read the actual motion, I have it before me. I will gladly do so.
Point of information.
Yes.
I will be moving this motion, but the motion that is in the package is different from the motion that was forwarded to you for inclusion in the package. So I move that the motion that's before us is the motion that was sent to you, which is a substitute resolution.
For the benefit of the people in the audience, the motion as it was sent to the chair included the motion in the packet. It also included 300 some odd pages of exhibits and an index. And I put out in the packet the motion without the exhibits and the index. And I believe Ms. Vasiliotis is asking that the motion as is being voted on be the complete document, including the exhibits and the index. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct.
Okay. And so noted. Any, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. It was moved by Ms. Vasiliotis, seconded by Mr. Mason. Any comment? Mr. Mason.
So, back in September, we saw issues hitting the media. We saw discussions going on. It was campaign season. There was certainly, there's no doubt that there was and I think you mentioned it before, and I want to give you amazing credit. I think at the end of the 2017 election, I've heard a lot of comments tonight about it was a clean campaign, it was issues-based. I would say, I didn't get invited to any barbecues, but maybe next time. But I would say this in all honesty, that election and the SEC complaint created internal strife that I wasn't part of. I never felt I was part of it. I sharing with all of you as my colleagues, I've said all along that I remember saying at the last meeting, this is not serving the town well in the media, in op-ed letters or opinion letters. I saw that we've all seen the issues that it's created. I said at our original September 23rd meeting, I think the political parties need to understand that all candidates, and I've since then I've even expanded to some of the RTM, need to be fully briefed and educated on how challenging the SEC can be to deal with, as I think you and Mr. Turner have pointed out to us. And what I see here is a resolution calling for our chair and caucus leader, if possible, to reach out to the parties. I can support this resolution. It seeks no other issue. I think there was a point in time where we looked for a committee, and we've tried that several times. The reason you have a resolution in there, and I will say there was conversations back with a committee of other action post-committee. That was never my intention. I can only speak for myself, and I'll say so when I'm doing that. I think the town has felt the brunt of the most influential, powerful board in the town having to go through this, and I would say that if there were another municipal election tomorrow, I would be reaching out to everybody I can for help, as I always do with filing forms, and we can't have this. I don't think there's anything in our motion. Some of it agrees with your motion, so I would be willing to support that. And as I look to the end term, I would also like to say to our two new members coming on board, one sitting with us and one sitting in the audience, that I'd always had a goal that we would have had this wrapped up in September or October or November, but now we're in December, so going forward, I hope we can support this and move forward.
Any further comment on this particular motion before we bring this to a vote? Ms. Crumick?
I'd just like to note that in reference to the data dump, kind of like a WikiLeaks dump that was attached to this motion, it would have been appropriate to include all consent orders regarding this matter, as well as to have documents that were not highlighted by one person. I'm sorry that if you were going to present documents, they weren't even-handed. Thank you.
Mr. Mason?
If I may, through you, Mr. Chair, I would like to say to Ms. Crumick, I 100% agree, and I will tell you that it was very clear that I did everything in my power, and I believe we offered through the chair that any other material that we didn't have would be more than welcomed, and we would agree to that. And I agree with you 100%, and that offer was there.
Anything else before we bring this item to, I'm sorry, Ms. Moriarty, I don't see the lady next to me for some reason. Ms. Moriarty?
I'll sit taller. I just can't let some of these statements go. This item was added to the agenda at the request of 4 Republican colleagues, and it has the implication of being an investigation, a complete investigation into a closed SCEC matter. This was a tactic used because it was a consequence of the September 23rd motion by 4 Republicans to set up a committee, which intended to bring the 2017 campaign into official town government business with the sole purpose to impact the 2019 BET election. The committee, the September 23rd motion asked to create a committee to investigate the prior campaign. The chair in October and November proposed committees, which were rejected by the same 7-5 vote that the September 23rd motion passed. So because the committee couldn't be constituted the way the supporting members of that September 23rd motion wanted it to, they decided to present what makes it look like their own completed investigation. And so the implication or the statement that other materials were asked for, I don't remember being asked for, but to be honest, I probably wouldn't have provided any because I don't know what standing 4 of my colleagues have or 6 of my colleagues have to determine what went on and what didn't go on in a matter of a few days when it took the SCEC more than a year to dispose of this matter. I do think that it took town government time and money and attention while we're still working on the BET business, and that this was abuse of the BET agenda process. I would ask the purpose of attaching the documentation that went on here. But I think it's a little disingenuous for my colleagues to say that we should just go vote on this and move on, because this has an effect that's far-reaching than this just BET. It impacts the willingness of residents to volunteer and to work on the behalf of the community. Look, I hope we can turn back the tide on the nastiness that has come with this effort. I'm not sure we can. It certainly won't be done in the near term, but I just think that the fact that this motion was made and the way it was made is an obvious intent to try and pursue an agenda which wasn't being proceeded or being acted on the way that they intended. Thank you.
Mr. Weisbrot.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a few words as well. Anyone who wants to read about the SEC, in addition to the material that Mr. Raymer just recited, is welcome and should go onto the portal of the SEC where the agreements are all there. It's all been transparent, ct.gov/SEC. An investigation has been made. Notwithstanding the fact that this investigation was made, the Republicans in the BET sought to do an investigation of their own. They made motions twice, and another one is on the table tonight. And in each case, there was a bipartisan group consisting of pillars of the community that were presented as people who would sit on a committee to evaluate this, as if an evaluation is needed when the SEC has completely investigated it. In each case, this blue ribbon commission was rejected. So you really have to wonder, these are civic-minded people of the highest reputation. You wonder whether the purpose of the investigation really is to promote, quote, public integrity as promoted, or whether it's really to extract maximum embarrassment. And embarrassment at a time just prior to the 2019 election, where reports have been featured in the press that said that this was being done, whether the reports are true, I don't know, as a way to help Freddie. This is a way we can help Freddie. So the maximum embarrassment has probably been achieved against volunteers who have served with diligence and commitment over the last many years. The reputations of the volunteers who have served are well known to our Republican colleagues. The investigation, or the purported investigation, Mr. Mason says they were not intending to be judge and jury, but it was never clear what the purpose of the investigation was, what it would cost, what its powers would be, what it would try to achieve. That was never reflected. The SEC concluded that and we've admitted this and we regret it, the five of us were given a $1,000 fine for, quote, accidental violations, which I think Mr. Raymer described in a very detailed way. For my own part, I regret, I've said this before, these mistakes, these filing mistakes. It's not necessary at this point to dwell on the fact that we relied in good faith on things that we shouldn't have relied in good faith on, in retrospect. At the end of the day, I think what has to be expressed is a sadness, really, that the BET, who under Section 1 of the town charter is, quote, the proper administrator of the financial affairs of the town, unquote, is being used in a partisan way, the effect of which is to undermine the trust and the good faith that members need to have in order to best serve the town. I don't agree with Mr. Mason that the business is normal, that we're conducting our business. Yes, we're all professionals, and we're all striving to achieve the best that we can for the town. But there's a chilling effect to this kind of thing. It affects the comity and the comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, and the decency in which people engage against each other. And that's hard to repair. A community where collaboration is really fundamental. And when that community is assaulted from within, sound governance becomes the first fatality. How do we attract high-quality volunteers, members in the community who see this kind of thing and say, well, how can you work together to really attack the financial problems facing Greenwich taxpayers? To use the BET to conduct a show trial so seriously violates the norms of this town and the good faith and the trust that are necessary for any democracy to function. I am turned off by these tactics, and I think many other people who seek to volunteer will be turned off as well. Last month's election gave a majority to the BET Republicans. In the flush of their success and the victory at the polls, the character of the Republican majority will be measured and assessed. The new majority will have the power to conduct the BET in a manner of their choosing. I hope they do so bearing in mind the norms of the community, because violating those norms creates divisiveness where the important tasks of government are sacrificed. And there is a reason that the Connecticut state law assigns campaign finance matters to the SEC. A town finance board doesn't have the requisite expertise, training, independence, budget, rigor, and oversight that resides in the SEC. I implore my Republican colleagues, even at this late moment, for us all, in fact, to come to our senses and to act in a manner that tradition, collaboration, and the time-honored Greenwich norms would expect from us. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who would like to be heard? Then I would call a
Yeah,
vote.
that-
I'm sorry.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, I
Yeah,
do.
Ms. Vassiliadis.
First, I need to address a few things. This resolution that's before you was not intended to be a tactic. This resolution in the committee that was initially requested was intended to be within the BET, not without the BET. In other words, there was no intention to have people outside of the BET on this committee. And it's funny how my colleagues talk about transparency, but yet reject a resolution that promotes transparency. I'm also sad. I'm sad that this was, because this was not a Republican fight. This was a fight within the Democratic Party that has spilled to the BET. In all respects, we, as the Republicans on this board, have tried to work diligently with the current chair to create a resolution that would be a win-win for both parties. Yet my colleagues across the aisle seem to forget that, we are colleagues, and they're refusing to meet us halfway. I'm sad, too, for this board, because I think that we all have abilities, and we all complement each other, and I'm hopeful that going forward, that we can work together as colleagues once again.
Thank you, Ms. Vassiliadis. Anybody else wish to be heard?
Mr. Raymer, I'd like to be heard.
Mr. Turner?
I'll try to keep my comments brief. I sit here tonight with my name in a settlement agreement that was knowingly and willingly signed by 5 members of the BET at the time that contains false statements. And those false statements are directly about me. And in September, I began to call for quite vigorously and continue to call for quite vigorously that the truth be given to the people. And I believe now the truth has been given to the people. What I am very concerned about is the idea of trust and the idea of honesty. There has been, and I have given in these meetings every opportunity for those 5 members, any one of them, to say, no, we did not knowingly and willingly sign a settlement agreement with false statements in it. I've yet to hear anyone deny that. And that is extremely, extremely, deeply troubling to me. It is personal to me. And when I look at how vested I am in the town, I started a business here. I'm raising a family here with 2 kids currently in school. My wife works in the local health system. You can't get more vested than I am. And to be held out on what heretofore has been a blemishless record of any kind, at this moment, my name is still in there with false accusations, and I just can't accept that. It would seem to me that, given Mr. Raymer's comments, that he would be willing to correct the record, be it in writing with the with SEEK or tonight. So then I could go on about trust. Trust has been broken by several members of the BET. Broken trust is going to impact employee productivity. It's going to impact private organizations that want to join with the 3 Ps. It's going to have an impact. And I don't know, going forward, who I can trust anymore because of what has happened here. Particularly when I hear that this was a campaign tactic. It couldn't be further from the truth. And here's an example of that. I sent an email on March the 1st of this year, March the 1st, to all 5 of my BET colleagues while we were sitting upstairs in a finance meeting, saying, While we are together today, I offer to share my experience from Wednesday on meeting with Seek and in advance of your meeting on Monday. Signed, Tony. Ladies and gentlemen, this email was never, ever responded to. And I sent this email because when I met with them in very, very late February, I saw it coming. And I knew that we needed and should have dealt with it far, far back in the timeline so it wouldn't be an election issue. It was never intended to be, and I think you see the message now. So I'm sitting here still with my name in the document. People have made accusations that simply aren't true. So what do I do about that? Would any of the 4 of the 5 BET members that are still here, would you like to now deny that you did it willingly and knowingly, sign a settlement agreement that had false statements in it about me? No one's still willing to do that. Those are all my comments, Mr. Chairman.
So since I was singled out by name, paragraph 5 of I have read you the October 2nd email, and you heard in it that he represented to us that he could support all 6 of us, that he had latitude from 2 enforcement attorneys. That you also saw that 8 hours earlier, he had an email from them saying that you couldn't do that. He's at least in the shade of gray. And then 2 weeks later, you saw the email from him,
Mr. Raymer, point of order, we've already gone over that. What is your point?
I'm entitled to speak, thank you.
But why are you reviewing all of that again?
Excuse me, I'm responding to what you raised, and I have the privilege to do so.
I would like to be able to do the same thing.
You're interrupting me, and I'd ask you please not do so.
Okay.
You also saw the ticket from the 13th expressing concern that he was misleading his colleagues, and there's no email from him bringing that to our attention. So the consent agreement that Mr. Turner says contains misstatements contains the following statements. Paragraph 5, it says, we relied upon his October 2nd email. Paragraph 6 says, we relied in good faith that he had reviewed the plan with the SEC and had approval. To this moment, Mr. Turner is saying he did have that approval. So you can assume that he was saying it to us. He's still saying it to us today. And then the operative paragraph, number 11, which troubles Mr. Turner, is Mr. Turner's statements and behavior were deceptive and misleading and lacked full disclosure. I'm not shrinking from that statement. I believe that statement to be correct. He had an obligation to bring to our attention the true tenor of his conversations with the SEC on the 2nd and the cautions that he received from them on the 13th. I'm sorry that he's troubled by it. When I put forward the factual presentation, I tried to be as fair and generous to all sides, but I'm not shrinking from the statement. I don't believe my statement contains any inaccuracies. I just realized that Mr. Turner and I have a difference of opinion, which I regret and I cannot resolve. Are there any other comments that anybody wants to make before we take a vote?
Yes.
I'll call a, pardon?
Yes.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you. I want to wrap up because I said in September that at that time, we needed to wrap this up so that we could heal and move forward and begin to work together again, particularly in preparation for what we know is going to be a very challenging financial year. But yet we are about to celebrate the holidays. Well, if you've been at my house, we've already started. And we're still dealing with this. It didn't have to be this way. It really didn't. And when I look at what I intended to do in the election and the benefits of that, I've never intended to cause the problems that it has caused, which is exactly why I communicated with SEEK to the equivalent of every 48 hours. If I called them every day, they probably would stop taking my calls. So I just hope that we're all mindful of where I sit, the challenges that I have with my name being in the document. I think going forward, the people's going to react to this. I think that they're going to decide. I don't know what they're going to decide. But when I look at the trust factor, and that's the underpinning of the American judicial system. Without that, we don't have anything. That is seeking the truth. And we still don't have it. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
I think we're ready for a vote. This is the motion put forward by the 4 Republican members. Obviously, a vote of yea is in support of the motion. A vote of nay is against the motion. I'll call the roll again. Mr. Dewis?
Yes.
Ms. Hess?
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod?
No.
Mr. Drake?
Yes.
Mr. Mason? Ms. Moriarty?
No.
Mr. Raymer votes no. Ms. Crumick?
No.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Ms. Vasiliotis?
Yes.
And Ms. Erickson? No. It's, the motion passes 7-5, 750. We now come to the item that was in old business that we have moved. It is the approval of the panel. I was expecting a motion from Mr. Mason. I don't know if it's coming.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion to add an item to the agenda relative to the September 23rd actions of the BET to form a committee in the SEC. That I know that'll need a second, and that is a 2/3 vote as well. And I will give you the motion if we, would you like the motion, what the motion is to add?
You need to identify enough of the motion so that the board knows what they're adding to the agenda.
Thank you. I make a motion that the BET annul the actions of the September 23rd, 2019 BET meeting to form a committee for the SEC elections relating to the 2017 campaign.
So that everybody's clear, the vote we're about to take is a vote of whether to add it to the agenda. It's not a vote, yea or nay, on the motion to annul. So I'll take the vote. It's a motion to suspend the rules, and it's not. Oh, yes, is there a second?
I second.
Sorry, thank you very much. I keep this clerk close to my elbow because she keeps me honest. So we now have a motion from Mr. Mason and a second from Ms. Vasiliotis. A motion to suspend the rules is not debatable, so we'll go directly to the vote. Again, you're only voting on whether to add it to the agenda. Mr. Deuce?
Yes.
Ms. Hess?
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod?
Yes.
Mr. Drake?
Yes.
Mr. Mason?
Yes.
Ms. Moriarty?
Yes.
Mr. Raymer votes yes. Ms. Crumick?
Yes.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Ms. Vasiliotis?
Yes.
Ms. Erickson?
Yes.
The item is now before us. Mr. Mason, it was your motion. You have the privilege of speaking first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say I think
Oh,
we've...
I'm sorry. A second, please, to Mr. Mason's motion before he speaks. Second by Ms. Sorry, Mr. Mason, please proceed.
Wow, you lost me on that one.
Sorry. Sorry.
Okay. The motion, thank you to my fellow members for adding this to the agenda. The motion simply seeks to revert the actions of the September 23rd, 2019 meeting. I think we've heard a lot of discussion on it. I think we have more agreement about candidates preparing and doing their forms in the future. I think we've had a lot of agreement on that issue. I think people all seem to think that they've been personally heard on this, and I don't think there's anybody who hasn't had their fair share of trials and tribulations on this. I will say some more than others. I hope you'll support this motion and pass it and move forward.
I'll mention that the passage of this motion will obviously moot the need to approve or disapprove a panel. At that point, Mr. Fogarty will go back to Westport shrieking with glee that he lives there and not here. And I'll take any further comment on the motion to annul. Is there any further comment? If there's no comment, I'll take a vote. This is a vote on the motion to annul. A yes vote annuls the action of September 23rd. A no vote declines to do so. No, I think I'm going to take a real vote. Mr. Deuce?
Yes.
Ms. Hess?
Yes.
Mr. Weisbrod?
Yes.
Mr. Drake?
Yes.
Mr. Mason?
Yes.
Ms. Moriarty? Mr. Raymer votes yes. Ms. Crumick?
Yes.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes.
Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Ms. Vasiliotis?
Yes.
And Ms. Erickson? That's a 12-0 vote. Thank you very much. That completes the greater part of the agenda. If I may, I note again that this is Mr. Turner's last meeting as part of the BET. I'm not going to eulogize him. He's not dead, although the thought did occur to me once or twice during the process.
Feeling is mutual, sir.
But I do want to mention in passing that Mr. Turner has been with us for 3 years. He joined us midstream in January of 2017 when Mary Lee Kiernan stepped down to become the CEO at the YW. He served, as was noted, on the New Lebanon Building Committee. In the 2017 term, he served on the Investment Advisory Committee. In the 2018-2019, the current term, he's chair of the HR Committee. He serves on the Investment Advisory Committee. He's the liaison to IT, which has been particularly important to us. He serves on the Cardinal Stadium Committee. Because it would be less disingenuous if I were to ask Mr. Mason now to speak further regarding his colleague, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anthony Tony Turner. Serving with you has been very interesting, to say the least. I, for one, can say that I've learned quite a bit from you during the almost 2 terms we have served together. Your knowledge about cybersecurity and football stadiums come to mind. As the chair of our HR committee, your work focused on HR issues and the creation of a new dialogue between the BET and the town departments. I would say terrific, and I think that goes with your committee members as well. However, the best lesson I take away from our time together on the BET is your approach to local government. When it comes right down to it, we on the BET are first and foremost all neighbors. We live in the same community. Our children attend the schools together. We share all of the town services that are offered to the residents. And most importantly, we all care about our town of Greenwich. Admittedly, sometimes we have common goals and sometimes we do not, but that's okay. Having everyone agree all the time wouldn't make it rather boring and would not make Greenwich the best town to live and work. Through your time on the BET, your professional, gentlemanly approach, and your willingness to learn and dive into the issues at hand has made it a pleasure to serve with you. Greenwich will always be served well with residents like you who are willing to get involved. On behalf of myself, the Republican caucus, and hopefully all of our members here, we wish you, thank you, good luck in your future service and your next adventure, and we don't think you're going to go too far. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Far away, 30 years in town, I don't think he's leaving.
We still have on the agenda the approval of minutes, but there's a chair's report that comes first. It's almost inappropriate for me, who's the chair for one meeting, filling in for Ms. Oberlander, to be giving a chair's report. I ought to be bringing Ms. Oberlander back up here to give the chair's report. But I sat down, I thumbed through the minutes, and I'd like to recount what does 2 years of BET look like. It looks like not just the normal budget issues, not just the budget, which had a 0 mill rate increase in the first year and a 2.75 in the second year. Spectacular results, in my opinion. Not just the RTM districts and committee meetings, but a ton of litigation. And Nathaniel Witherell the prior committee report and the new committee, modifications to the policy and procedures manual to create 4 members' ability to put an item on an agenda, which has been extremely painful to me for the last 4 months. The completion of new lab, we broke ground during this time, during our term, and saw the school open and running. We went through the Nathaniel Witherell Committee and the HDG studies and the PKF O'Connor-Davies studies. Audit Committee doing the audit of the septic haulers and the cash handling, harbor management, and shellfish being brought into a proper budget function with us now. We have struggled through with TAG and Safe Rides through their near-death experience. I hope they're out of it now. Internal audit policy established. The completion of the Byram Pool and Park. Hamilton Avenue Playground has been embarked upon. Retirement Board custodian, retirement board discount rate changes, the Julian Curtis roof, and then consequentially the school's capital projects process being looked at, Bloom Shapiro. Debt policy, fund balance policy. I saw Ms. Moriarty twitch when I said that. A forensic audit of parking services, budget guidelines twice. Newberger Berman, 10-year revaluation coming up and all the work that's being done under our authority by the assessor. We've had successive floods at the schools, the science wing at the high school, Mesa at the high school, Coscob, Hamilton Avenue frozen pipe broke, cash management changes at Treasury, Nathaniel Witherell special project requests for elevators and then later on boilers. Senior tax credit ordinance, Northwest Fire Station, everybody winces with that one. The fire safety study, matrix, tax collection and delinquent taxes, renovation to the Byram Fire Station, renovation and completion at Central, renovation at the private fire station of Round Hill, cybersecurity, I'll say it twice more, cybersecurity, town clerk internal audit, the renewal at Munis. We bought a piano, the Cardinal Stadium, the overtime overruns at Nathaniel Witherell, the Greenwich Plaza. We'll be hearing more about Greenwich Plaza. Eastern Greenwich Civic Center, the GEA labor contracts, school lunch fund, styrofoam, stainless steel dishwashers, the firing range of Greenwich Police Department, the boilers at the high school, Board of Ed phone system, the loss of our internal auditor, the study we embarked upon on playing fields, and most of all, last 4 months worth, the investigation of the SEC violations, the investigation of the SEC violations, the investigation of the SEC violations. We've had a busy year. This is a hard-working panel. We do a lot of good work. We've hurt ourselves in the last quarter. We've got some repairs to make. We're good people. I think we can get there, but we were stupid. Now we need to get more smart. We've had a good year, and I thank you very much, every one of you, for your effort in this good year. We now have minutes, if the secretary would.
Thank you. I'd like to break them out. I'd like a motion to approve the revised minutes of the BET's October 24th, 2019 meeting.
Seconded. Is there any corrections or changes to the October 24th meeting minutes?
It's the next one.
Are there any changes or corrections to the October 24th meeting minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Beth, you want to go on with the November? Sorry, I beg your pardon. Oh, and I'm sorry, 1101. Thank you, sorry.
With regard to the November 18th, 2019 minutes, I'd like to ask that there's a Scrivener's error that we dropped one clause in the chair's report, and I'd like to add it back in so that the sentence reads as follows. It's the It's the last sentence under Chair's report. Ms. Oberlander expressed her thanks to the dedicated town employees who work to make the BET's job easier, and especially, and this is where I'm adding the clause, the town assessor's office, and then back to the text, the finance department for their hard work, friendship, and support during the last 2 years. Sorry, it was the second to the last sentence, not the last sentence. So I'd like to make a motion to approve. I need a second.
So this is a motion to approve the minutes of November 18th as amended, as you heard. Any further comment on that? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And one abstention? So it's 11-01 approval of the minutes. I'm looking to I'm sorry, do you have something before the last motion of the day?
No.
Oh, this is the last motion of the day? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Drake might have something.
Who seconded that? I'm sorry.
I did.
You did, okay.
Mr. Drake?
Thank you for the way you wrapped all this up. And can I propose, having heard my colleagues and taken to heart what Leslie Moriarty said and David said and others said, I'm looking forward to being cooperative colleagues again. It's our responsibility for the town. And the first step of that is, let's have our annual dinner, which we have every 2 years when the term turns over. So in the next week, you'll probably hear from somebody for us to organize the dinner that we do every 2 years. Emails coming your way. Let's get back to cooperating.
Thank you, Mr. Drake. Mr. Dewis, I believe you had a motion?
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Yes, she has, yeah.